Okay, in this video, I'm going to be talking about a really basic intro or rundown on how to use ACES in Renderman and also talk about using it in Substance Painter to some degree. So first, I wanted to kind of point out this setup I have here. Right now, I am working in essentially my default color space within both Substance Painter and Renderman. This is a render from iRay, and then this is a render from Renderman. So in Renderman, we are working by default in a linear sRGB color space. So you can see down here, actually let's go up here. So we'll go down up to view, we can kind of view our color space right here. So image color space is essentially the color space that our rendering space is being manipulated in. Again, linear isn't really a color space, it's an adjustment to a color space. So essentially we're working with sRGB color primaries or color gamut, but with linearized values. I'm making probably a simplistic simplification. I'm making probably a simplified explanation of that, but that's just generally what's happening. And then because we can't really see, linear isn't meant to be displayed on our monitors, I have essentially a transformer lookup table that is changing from linear to sRGB. So right now I'm viewing it in sRGB on my monitor. And so we can see that we have image color space linear, display view, should be sRGB, but there's a weird bug. I don't know why it always says Rec 709, but it's actually technically an sRGB. We can switch it to Rec 709. Just has a slightly higher contrast to it. Same color space for our monitor. sRGB and Rec 709 have the same color gamut. Anyways, so I like to do this whenever I am seeing, especially if I'm worried about color space, and if I'm adjusting from one color space to another. I almost always do this as I, take a screenshot or have Substance Painter pulled up, look at that compared to what I have in Renderman, and just make sure I have more or less the same thing. Of course, this one has a gray floor that's bouncing up. This one doesn't, so that's why it's missing some values right here, but everything else looks pretty good. Okay, so next I'm going to show you guys how to convert to ACES for working with textures that I textured in an sRGB linear color space. So if you haven't been messing with Substance Painter's color space, or wherever you're pulling your textures, if you haven't been converting your textures, we're going to assume that they are in linear sRGB for color information, and we're not really going to worry about data information like roughness or anything that's in like a 16-bit TIFF or EXR file, because those files are pretty much, shouldn't have to worry about the color space too much. So I'm going to close this for now. So right now I'm viewing it in the default color space. So in order to enable ACES, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first I save the version of this image again. Let's go ahead and go here. So I have it right here. So I'm just going to pull up this image just so I can compare it later on once I switch to ACES and make sure everything is being converted correctly. Okay, so when you're switching to ACES, you have to close the image tool, because the image tool, even if you switch to ACES, it's going to be stuck in the previous kind of color transformations. So I'm going to close that. I'll stop that render. Okay, I'm going to open up my render settings. And if I'm in a newer version, I believe, of Maya, I think maybe as recently as Maya 2022 or maybe Maya 21, we have what's called an OCIO configuration. Let me go ahead and pull up something like that so you guys can see what that looks like. Okay, so you can find an OCIO configuration file from just searching color OCIO, stands for Open Color Input Output, I'm pretty sure. That's what the IO stands for. Or you can find it on the official Open Color IO page. This is something that I'm not 100% sure because I had already had configuration files on my computer, but newer versions of both Substance Painter and I think Maya come with some Open Color IO configuration files. So, you can try doing the color configuration information without installing anything. See if you can switch to ACES or another color space through Renderman or a Substance Painter. If you can't, then you might have to install it depending on your version of Maya or Substance Painter. And if you want to know how to do that, I recommend checking out this video, Renderman Fundamentals, ACES and Renderman. So the way some of it's outdated now because this was for older version of Renderman. Like, so for instance, he's converting his textures inside of Nuke. You don't technically have to do that if you want to dive into ACES, but the installation of the Open Color IO configuration file onto his machine, that step is still good. So only do this though if you can't, for some reason in your version of Maya or Substance Painter, you don't have ACES. The essentially open color IO is going to have a bunch of color space information, different color spaces in the transforms to get it to those color spaces. So that's kind of a necessary step for this. Okay, so back inside of Renderman, I open my render settings. I'm going to come over here to Renderman. And I'm going to come over to this features tab. If I scroll down, we have that open color IO spot right here. By default, the configuration is set to off. What that means is that it's not using any color management besides what Maya and Renderman are already doing. So if I want to switch this, I can click on this and I can do ACES 1.2. So in this video, I'm just kind of covering going into ACES. And there might be a new version of ACES if you're watching this video later, but the current version of ACES, the newest one is ACES 1.2. If there's new versions, you might have to download a new OCIO configuration file, or maybe a new version of Maya comes with it, but we'll just go ahead and click that. So I'll click on ACES 1.2. I'll click close. And so by default, nothing really seems to have changed. But when I go ahead and open my renderer, so we're going to go ahead and click on IPR. You'll now notice that it looks different, right? Definitely looks wrong. There's a lot of things that don't look quite the same, and we'll go ahead and pull up that image so we can compare, right? So the colors are really weird, especially this like blue environment reflection light, like that super saturated blue. You can see there's a subtle blue, but it's not that saturated. And obviously my diffuse colors are not quite right. And there's definitely a possibility that my normal maps, my displacement maps, my specular maps, they could be slightly off too. So what's happening is that what Renderman will be doing is it'll try to convert our textures so that they are going to be compatible with ACES, right? Because when I do my texturing outside of well, I can't do my texturing in Renderman, but if I'm doing my texturing in another program, right, that other program isn't necessarily making textures that are compatible with ACES. They're usually doing it with an sRGB encoding if they're in color. And so what we need to do is we need to let Renderman know, hey, you need to convert these textures so that they're compatible with ACES. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to open up this texture manager. So this texture manager is where whenever we bring in textures, we essentially control the conversion of our textures into the .tex format that Renderman uses. So Renderman is going to take all of our input images and convert them to a .tex format, which is what it uses to render with. So when I come in here, if I click on these, hopefully you've been in here before. Whenever you attach a new texture, I always click on parse scene, and then it'll be like a little gray kind of arrow, I think, whenever it's like processing, and then whenever it's done, we get this green check mark. So I'm going to come over to all these textures and just take a look at them. So we have, let's see, I'll start with the head just because that's the one the most obviously wrong. So when we click on this, we have our texture type. So this is going to be automatically detecting what type of file it is. So you can see if I come over to panorama, you can detect that's meant to be an environment map. So I'll come here to diffuse color. So head diffuse color. And we see right here we have color space. It's also going to detect like what type of file format it is, like what depth it has. We don't have to really worry about that right now. But you'll see that it's not really making a conversion from anything to ACCG. So it doesn't really know what the input color image file or color space is. It's just going to ACCG. So this is set in, if it's going to be a color map, and especially if it's going to be like a PNG or JPEG, it's going to be a sRGB image encoding or color space encoding, so that the color space is meant to be displayed and worked with a sRGB color workflow or color space. And the problem was what we had before when we were doing this with the default color space in Renderman before we switched over to ACES is we were doing like a linear color flow sRGB. And so, the reason why our texture maps didn't look wrong because we weren't working in a, here, let me go and pull this up really quickly. Right, when we were working on this one right here, right, the rendering space was linear, right? Even though our textures were sRGB. So our color space was a linearized sRGB. So it has a lot of adjustment to it. The reason why my color maps look like they did in Substance Painter is because when I import those textures, as I'm sure you guys know by now, whenever we use color, so if we use so here's my diffuse, and let's go ahead and let's minimize this. Let's pull this stuff all over. So when I bring my diffuse, right, this is a color map, so it's color that we're going to see in the renderer. We linearized it. So essentially adjusted our color values, our pixel color values, to undo the sRGB encoding so that it's linearized. Our data is not being adjusted incorrectly, which I'm not going to be going into color space information. Please refer to my lecture on that if you're in my class. We're not going to get super in depth of that. And the other one we do for that is the specular face color, right? So we linearize those two. So they were sRGB, and then we linearize them for the default Renderman color space. And let's go. Oh, where'd it go? Here it is. So we're going to have to do something similar. We're not going to linearize it because we're going into a completely different color space. We're not doing a linearized sRGB. We're doing ACES CG, which has a different color gamut, has different colors it can work with. So we need to make that adjustment. So I'm going to come back over here, and we'll come over here. So what I'm going to do is I need to let it know, hey, this is what the texture map was, its color space was. So if it's going to be a color map, what I want to define it as is sRGB texture. That's saying, hey, this was done in the sRGB color space, and it's a texture map. Okay. So I click on that. I click apply. What I'll probably want to do is I want to go ahead and stop this render just so it goes faster. Usually when your renders are running, it takes longer to process. So now when I go ahead and render that again, you'll see that color looks much more accurate, right? And so if I come over to that image, let's just compare it, right? It's a little darker, but it is pretty close, right? This is something where, because I'm working with different color primaries, I would probably go in and, essentially, actually, you know what? There's one more thing we have to do before we go in and adjust textures and be like, oh, this is just the difference between ACES and sRGB linear, is that I'm actually working in the wrong color space still. So remember when we came in here and we looked at view image color space, you'll see that now we have ACES, right? We're still looking at an sRGB color transform, so it's still adjusting it to sRGB for my monitor, but the image color space is ACES. The problem that a lot of people run into, this is really important, is by default, ACES chooses ACES 2065-1, which is the super huge color gamut. It's essentially the archival color space, which sounds cool because it has a really big color space, but in reality, it's just has a lot of different problems for CG workflows. So the recommended is ACES CG. It has a smaller color gamut, colors, so like less colors that we can work with, but it's still really big, and it just essentially it works a lot better for our CG workflow. So when I click on that, there we go. That saturation looks a lot better, especially in that reflection right there. And it looks pretty darn similar, right? You see there's a little bit more contrast and maybe a little bit slightly off color saturation, or colors. And that just has to do with, the fact that they have very different color spaces, like what means red in sRGB versus what is red in ACES are different. So if I need to make adjustments on that, at this point, I would just have to use something like an HSL node or make the adjustments in Substance Painter to compensate. So anyways, let's continue with that texture manager. So I'll come back to that texture manager. So you'll want to go through and you'll want to double check this on your texture maps. What Renderman will do is it will actually detect it'll read your texture's name, and it will actually use like a naming convention to determine, hey, which color space should I automatically switch to? So ideally, it would set up sRGB texture for me on all my color maps, and then so we'll do that on the body as well. So we'll set that to sRGB texture, and we'll click apply once we're done with these. Any data, so roughness, any grayscale maps like a roughness map. What other ones are there? Displacement map. Well, I don't know. There's a lot of other ones. A subsurface scattering map, right? Like how deep the scattering goes, or even a mask, right? A black and white mask. For those, you want to use data. So you want to switch this to data. What's that saying is like, this is a data map, don't convert it. It's not meant to be used as a color or viewed as color, just don't convert it. So anything you don't want to actually be adjusted by a color transform, you set it to data, okay? So same thing with this, all these specular roughness, this is all data information. Face color is viewable, right? This is the color of my reflections. So all that is definitely going to be sRGB texture. So anything that's going to be color based that we're going to see in the viewport, We want it to be texture. Normal map, even though it's a color map, as in it has colors in it, it's still a data map. We don't see the normal information as color, we see it as surface deformation. So these ones I also want to have as data. So anything that's supposed to be like scalar information or something like a normal map or anything that's not going to be viewable as color in the render, we want to kind of more or less have it as data. That's just a rough kind of standard that we can work with. And then anything that's going to be a color map that we're going to see in the render, so the specular face color or the diffuse color, we want it to be sRGB texture. And so let's go ahead and I'm going to make sure, I'm going to switch that to this and switch back to data. Actually, okay, so I went ahead and applied all of them, so that's good. And then the panorama HDR, what we want for this one is we want sRGB linear. So if you've already started an ASYS and you import your texture maps, usually it handles this for you. If you already started your project and you switched over to ASYS, there's a good chance that it's not going to particularly know what to do, or it won't do all the information for you or conversions for you. So I'm just going to make sure this is in sRGB linear, click apply. Just to be safe, I usually go ahead and restart my IPR. And there we go. So this is not much has changed, and that's probably because all the other maps were working pretty fine. I think my specular roughness changed a little bit. But yeah, mostly it's going to be that diffuse color map that's an issue. And as always, what I like to do is I'll compare it to that render I had done in the, I'm calling this legacy, but this is really linear sRGB, the default color space, and just compare them. Okay, so I definitely have more contrast, which is just going to be a look that is going to be coming with ASYS. It's going to have a little bit more contrast to it. But yeah, those colors look pretty solid. Those reflections are looking similar, right? Very similar. And yeah, all my other information is looking good. Some gotchas that I recommend you guys look out for is displacement. I'm not using displacement here, but by default, if you export displacement out of Substance Painter, it's usually going to be like an 8-bit or 16-bit. And for some reason, the Renderman by default has a hard time knowing that that's supposed to be a data map. So it'll actually do that sRGB tech. Oh, let's make sure that's sRGB texture. Apply. By default, it might not know that that's supposed to be sRGB texture. So, or data. So we want a displacement map to be data, right? Because it's, again, not color information. But it'll still apply sRGB texture, which will make your displacement look wrong. So just double check. When you switch to ASYS, you really need to come in here, and almost none of these actually stuck. Let's do data, 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 and data. And this part is, in all honesty, it's nice because we don't have to convert our textures outside of Renderman, but it is really tedious. So let's go here. That's going to be sRGB texture and sRGB texture apply. And I think that might make that specular a little darker, which is, no, actually, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, the reflections are reflections are a little bit darker, which is good down here. But anyways, so yeah, so that displacement, I'm not working with displacement on this one, but when you use that displacement, just be careful. So just as a recap, if it's going to be color, we want it to be sRGB texture. So if it's going to be specular face color, diffuse color. If it's going to be like a roughness map, a normal map, a displacement map, or any type of mask or any other data, we want it to be a data map, which is just saying don't do any color adjustments because these aren't color values. And then if it's going to be a dome light or environment light, most of the time you want to do sRGB linear because it's already in a linearized color space. So the thing about this is ASYS, when we're working earlier in the default linear sRGB workflow in Renderman, the color space, how do you say this? When I convert this from in that texture manager right here, what it's doing is it's going ahead and linearizing it for us. So it's converting to the new color space and it's also linearizing. Because it's doing that, we technically don't need to have our texture maps. So let's do the diffuse color right here. We'll come over here. We technically don't need it linearized. You'll see when I uncheck it, it's not going to do anything. It's going to look essentially exactly the same. But we don't really technically need to click on linearize. Okay, so that's the basic rundown. We'll still want to export this as when you're doing the renders, if you want to bring it into Nuke or something like that, definitely export as an EXR. Don't export as like a PNG or JPEG because it's going to bake in this display transformation to sRGB. We want to keep it in ASYS in that EXR file, so that in Nuke we can work with all the colors and information. If I do export as a PNG or JPEG, it's going to bake it all down, and I lose a lot of that information. So definitely export it as an EXR, but if you're doing a batch render, by default, it's going to export as an EXR. Okay, so let's take a look at this in Substance Painter. So here I have a project that is in the default. So it's using what's called the legacy workflow, which is essentially linear sRGB. So this is what my model looks like. And if I come up here, if I want to switch it to a different color workspace, I'll come up here to project configuration. So here's an issue, kind of an issue. As it is, in terms of like my knowledge of Substance Painter and the documentation that's out for Substance Painter, is that it's kind of hard to convert a project from one color space to another and not have it look weird, and have to go through a lot of work to try to make it all the colors to work right. Come down here to color, but we're going to go ahead and go through this just to kind of show you what it looks like. So you can see by default it's legacy, and you can see it's doing linear sRGB, right? So that's what Renderman was using too. So if I click on this and go to Open Color IO, now what we can do is we can have more color management. Essentially, I can change what my rendering space color space is, and also like my input and output maps, like what color space they're going to come in as. So you can see right here, it's defaulted to linear. So that's my working color space, what it's rendering in. If I click right here on Substance, I can switch it down to ACES 1.2. And this is essentially the settings I recommend if you're going to be working in ACES 1.2 in Substance Painter. You can look at this, come back to it. I also have this page here. So we'll come over to color management. Here, okay. So I recommend Googling Liam Collard if you want to read more about this, and then Substance Painter with OCIO. And so he has this really great in-depth article that's just talking about things to look out for, things to kind of keep in mind when you're working with Substance Painter and with ACES. And so the reason why I'm wanting to do this in the first place, because Renderman can, take this legacy color linear sRGB color space information and all these images and convert it for me, right? Technically, in a lot of ways, I don't really need to worry about working in ACES and Substance Painter necessarily. But the ideal situation is I'd be working in ACES inside of Substance Painter from the beginning, so that when I bring it into Renderman, it looks exactly the same. So you'll notice when we looked at this, there was slight differences between what I'm seeing inside of Renderman and inside here, right? Especially that like red, right? Those are slightly different colors. And that's just because when I was working in Substance Painter, I was working in linear sRGB, and this is what I thought red was going to be, but in ACES, red is a different color. So that's a thing that I have to keep in mind. Sorry also for my fluxes changing from orange to blue, depending on the program I'm in. So ideally, what you would be doing is you'd be working in ACES within Substance Painter from the beginning, so that what you have in ACES or in Substance Painter looks exactly like what you're going to get in Renderman with ACES. So anyways, I'm going to show you guys, I'm going to convert it and show you guys why it looks wrong. So I'll say okay. And you'll see right away my colors look really weird, right? So by default, just converting your project to ACES and Substance Painter isn't going to be super great, right? It's not going to work super well. Something that you can do though, if you want to, it becomes a little tedious, is you can export your textures from your legacy, and then you can import them back into ACES after you've converted it. So I can go ahead and I'll show you guys a file I already have. So we'll do file, Jade, discard. So this one I had already converted to ACES, and you'll see I'll hide this. That was exactly what I did, right? I had that legacy workflow. I went to edit project configuration, went down to color space, and just switched it to Open Color IO, and then ACES 1.2, and then I got the goofy stuff. Then what I did was I had exported my textures beforehand. So inside of when I had that open in that legacy format, what I did is I created a new fill layer and I imported my textures. So let me go ahead and pull those up really quickly. So you can see that here we have our texture maps. I just imported them in, and then I dropped them into this fill layer here, 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 and here. So when you work with that ACES project configuration right here, essentially what these are telling it is, here's our color space that we're rendering in, ACES CG. here is our image import images. So if I'm importing textures, here's what color spaces they're going to be by default. Essentially, it's telling Substance Painter, hey, this is going to be the color space information. So when I bring in like that color map, let's say I did it in Photoshop or download off the internet, or in this case, I exported it from a previous Substance Painter file that was an sRGB. I'm saying utility sRGB texture. So whenever you see utility sRGB texture, it's going to be very similar to in Renderman right here, this sRGB texture. So if you're ever looking for that, like I'm working with an sRGB texture map, which is like most color maps, I want utility sRGB texture. Same thing with 16-bit. And then for floating point images, we want utility linear sRGB. This material color space is going to be my materials in Substance Painter. So if you go to the material browser over here, this is going to be the color space those materials are going to be in. By default, it switches to ACES CG. I recommend going back to utility sRGB, let's see, utility sRGB texture right here. And that's because most of those materials weren't made for ACES CG. They were usually made for the default sRGB linear color workflow. So usually that's when I would switch. And then when I export them, we could export them as ACES CG, right? So they're already in the ACES CG format. But in my opinion, I think it's better for the 8-bit and 16-bit to just stay utility sRGB texture and let Renderman switch it back for you. So Renderman can convert it from sRGB texture to ACES for you. Just it's a preferred color workflow. Okay. So I just imported those in. And you can see I got that texture map. All my textures are behaving appropriately. If there's a texture map that's different, so for instance, let's say most of them I want them to be sRGB texture, but let's say there's one that I imported and actually happened to be converted to ACES or something else. You can click on this little drop down right here on that image input on that fill layer, and you can change them per input. So I can come here and you can see it's set to sRGB texture, but I can change it to something else, right? So I can, I'll come in here just to show you it's wrong, but I'll set it to ACES CG, right? And that looks totally wrong. But if you need more fine-tooth control, you can come in here and change the color space of that input specifically. So that texture map coming in and plugging in here, where it plugs in here, I'm converting it to a different color space. And just like before, when I export my textures, I'll go ahead and export textures. I actually have no control over its color space. You'll see by default when I switch it to in that open color IO and with ACES, it's going to switch to 16-bit. You guys are probably used to seeing in 8-bits. Switch it to Renderman Pixar Surface. You'll see there's no real color information that I can change. What you should be able to see, and let's go ahead and export this texture. So let's go ahead and go here. So ACES export, select file, export. Okay, and you'll see here, I actually don't really know if this is in the default one too, but you'll see right here, I have my diffuse color and it has that utility sRGB texture. So that's going to be that naming convention that helps Renderman, when I process those textures, automatically know, hey, this is supposed to be a color texture map, and it's an sRGB. Let me go ahead and fix that for you. Or, hey, this is a data map. Let me not make an adjustment to it. So that naming convention that's added to the name there can help you with that. And if you look at those output templates, that's what that color space right there is. If you're using Legacy, I don't think by default it adds a color space information in there for you. So it's a kind of like a nice little addition to it. So you don't have to go through that whole process necessarily of naming or identifying or converting those textures or switching how Renderman is converting it for you. It should automatically help do that for you. And as always, when I'm exporting those textures, if the file format or the color space format that they're in isn't in here, it's going to be defined in that project configuration under output or export, sorry. And so if you need to export your textures and you want them in a different color format, this is where you would convert them. Okay. And if you're starting a new asset, you just go File, New, and whenever you do this goes set to 2048. We can make sure that under Color Management, we set it to Open Color IO. And if I want it to be in ACES eventually, setting to ACES 1.2, and then that should all be good. And then, of course, import my asset. And so that would be if you're starting a new asset, how you can start it from the very beginning from ACES if you know what you're doing from the beginning. So just as a recap, if in Renderman I want to go ahead and switch to working with ACES, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I close Image Tool, this card. I'm going to go ahead and go into my render settings, go to the Renderman, features, down to configuration, change it from off to ACES 1.2. Then whenever I go ahead and open my image tool again, it will go ahead and switch over to the ACES transforms for me. The default color space, ACES 2065, is not what you want to use. Don't use that one. So what I do is I'm going to go ahead and go to my view, image color space, ACES, and switch it to ACES CG. Or if you have this pixel readout down here, you can change it down here as well. And we're in ACES. Now we're working in ACES and Renderman. And then for my texture maps, when I'm importing them, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and open up that texture manager. And I want to make sure that for my diffuse colors and my specular face colors, that it is using the color space sRGB texture, letting it know, hey, it has sRGB color space on it. Anything like a normal map or a roughness map or a displacement map or any masks you have, like black and white masks, we want to make sure they're set to data. And if we're working with a panorama, or sorry, an HDRI image or anything that's attached to your dome light, we'll want to make sure those are sRGB linear. And whenever you switch that, you just click on that little apply button to make sure it switches over. If I export it out of Substance Painter and it has, let's do file, export textures, it should go ahead and add that file format or that naming convention to my format, that color space to it. And so that when I export it, we have sRGB texture already packed into it in raw. So if you're messing around in anywhere and you're looking for the relevant color space for color maps, so like a JPEG or a PNG, then you want to look for utility sRGB texture. That usually refers to sRGB textures, what you're looking for. That refers to color maps. Raw is usually referring to data maps that you don't want to have any color conversions attached to it. And then sRGB linear would be if you're exporting or saving or switching a color space on a HDRI image. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. I'm not going to get into going from Renderman into Nuke. That's a whole nother topic. But I also recommend that you guys be careful when you're doing this. It's really easy to get confused with color space stuff and transforms. I get confused very easily with it. And it can, even though working in that, larger color space is cool, right? It has like a more contrast, more interesting colors. And the highlights in certain areas and certain surfaces look better as well. It still is very easy to mess something up, and it doesn't necessarily always mean your work is going to be better. So working in ACES doesn't naturally make your work better. It just gives you a bigger color gamut to work with and a better color workflow if you know how to manage color. If you don't know how to manage color, in all honesty, it probably adds more headache than it's worth. Okay, hope that helps.